Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating, frankly data-heavy political critique. We're looking at a recent Sky News Australia segment that unleashes an absolute barrage of allegations against the Albanese government. Now, the central thesis of this broadcast is totally uncompromising. It essentially argues that the government is defined by a series of broken promises and deliberate misdirections. So rather than taking any sides here, we're going to act as a neutral lens. We're going to dissect the anatomy of this critique to understand exactly how the broadcaster builds its case, piece by piece, using the very arguments and evidence they presented on air. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To make sense of it all, we're organizing this dense critique into 6 clear pillars: the core argument, cost of living claims, transparency and integrity, national security, taxation changes, and finally, polling and media reaction.
Starting us off with pillar number 1, the core argument, promise versus reality. To really establish a baseline, the segment immediately points back to a specific 2022 pledge from Anthony Albanese, where he stated, "My word is my bond." The host actually uses this specific phrase as an uncompromising yardstick. They're basically arguing that the standard the government set for itself is exactly what it's failing to meet today. You'll see this quote act as the anchor for literally every single allegation of a broken promise that follows.
Moving right along to Section 2, cost of living claims.
The critique leans super heavily on one very specific figure, and that's $275. Through a pretty extensive montage, the host highlights the government's highly repeated campaign promise that energy system changes would reduce household power bills by exactly this amount. The segment's argument? That everyday Australians simply haven't seen this relief materialize. And this brilliantly illustrates how the broadcast counters that narrative of lowered living costs. They juxtapose that promised relief with another, much starker number, 15. That is the count of interest rate rises under the current Prime Minister. By laser focusing on mortgage stress, the host argues that the original economic promises have been, well, completely shattered.
Which brings us to Section 3, transparency and government integrity.
Setting the stage here, the segment highlights the leadership's original pledge for, quote, a more honest and transparent government going forward. But, as you might guess, this promise is immediately met with what they present as contradictory evidence. Now, what's really interesting about this is how they use third-party data from the Center for Public Integrity to make their point. They highlight a massive decline in freedom of information compliance, noting that a mere 25% of requested government information is actually being handed over, leaving 75% withheld. This steep drop is framed by the host as hard empirical proof of a broken transparency promise. The broadcast then zooms in on individual ministers, directly contrasting their shifting public narratives. For example, they play audio of the finance minister's initial claim that no one had any knowledge of the Brittany Higgins allegations, and follow it up immediately with a later admission of being aware of some allegations in the days leading up. The segment takes this shift, something often softly labeled as misleading in political circles, and forcefully calls it outright dishonesty. All right, shifting gears to Section 4, national security and immigration.
The host walks the viewer through a really specific step-by-step timeline regarding the repatriation of so-called ISIS brides. It starts with the Prime Minister explicitly denying reports that they were returning. Then, shortly after, a news break confirms 13 brides and their children were indeed coming back. The broadcast uses this rapid-fire contradiction to allege that the public was deliberately misled.
But the coverage actually goes a step further, focusing on the Home Affairs Minister's claim that the government was doing nothing to help these individuals. The host counters this by asserting that a government associate took 35 passports to a refugee camp to actively assist these individuals in leaving. It's framed as direct, undeniable proof that the government's hands-off claims were entirely false.
Next up is Section 5, taxation and superannuation changes.
Here, the critique just unleashes a rapid-fire list of alleged promises surrounding wealth. We're talking about altering Stage 3 tax cuts away from higher earners, slapping unexpected superannuation caps on balances over $3 million, and shifting stances on negative gearing and capital gains tax, policies that were previously sworn to be left completely untouched.
So the crucial point the broadcast makes here isn't just about the policy change itself. It's about the sheer repetition of the original promise. They point out that the Prime Minister answered yes a staggering 50 times when asked to rule out changes to negative gearing, before ultimately reversing course. The segment totally mocks the defense that they were simply changing a position, arguing that, to voters, a reversal like that translates as a straight-up lie.
And finally, we hit Section 6, polling and media reaction.
Let's see how this builds into real-world consequences.
How is the electorate actually reacting? Breaking down Resolve polling data, the host highlights significantly negative views across the board. 42% of homeowners, 39% of those currently paying off a house, and crucially, 31% of 18 to 34-year-olds, a demographic theoretically meant to benefit from these changes, all hold negative views. The host's argument? The electorate is actively punishing these reversals.
Zooming out for a second, the broader macro statistics they present paint a pretty stark picture of declining trust. A massive 83% of voters believe a promise was broken. 61% are bracing for even more unprompted tax changes, and nearly half believe the budget will actively worsen their financial position. It's presented as definitive evidence of a fundamentally fractured relationship with voters.
Now, to explain how a government supposedly gets away with this, the segment turns its sights on the rest of the media. The host plays a lengthy quote from a Guardian podcast where a commentator literally states, "You kind of have to break trust to restore trust." The Sky News segment uses this specific soundbite to argue that parts of the press are running a sort of protection racket. They assert that by justifying political deception as just a necessary evil in an unreasonable media environment, commentators are providing the government with explicit permission to lie.
Which brings us to a pretty compelling final thought. By dissecting this Sky News segment, we can see exactly how modern political media constructs a narrative of broken trust, using the government's own words, shifting timelines, and hard polling data as ammunition. But it leaves us with a critical question to reflect on. Does framing every single political and policy shift as a broken promise fundamentally damage our overall trust in elections? Or is this kind of relentless, hyper-focused accountability simply the reality of how modern political media must operate? It's a genuinely fascinating dynamic and one that is absolutely worth exploring further. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.